Can I welcome you to what I know is going to be a great conference? We've got Ed Miliband speaking to us this afternoon, but we've also got a great array of other speakers, starting with our first panel after I've done my introduction. None of this would be happening without Robert Philpott, Richard Angel, and the Progress team, who are fantastic. Can we give them a big round of applause for the phenomenal job they do with Progress? Can we also congratulate the 538 Labour councillors who were elected last Thursday? That 538 is more than twice as many as we won in the county elections in 2009, and the Labour vote is up by a fifth, so we're on our way back. Can I do a quick party political broadcast? There's a book that's just published today called 5 Days in May, selling for the bargain basement price of £10 out there, and if you're really lucky, you might get one of the unsigned ones, but I'm happy to give you one of the signed ones too. I can't resist just reading out one or two of the excerpts about the final conversations between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg. In the penultimate conversation between the two, I write, Gordon moved on to the principles behind any coalition. A Lib-Lab coalition would be pro-Europe, pro-Keynesian, pro-industrial policy, pro-fairness. Where would Nick be with the Tories? On Europe, where would he be in the first crisis where possible treaty changes or joint economic action was the issue? This Europe issue unsettled Nick. I am worried about the Conservatives on Europe, he said. Well, a fat lot of good being worried about it did 3 years later. And then their very final conversation, when Nick was trying to spin Gordon out in terms of hanging on at the end so he could negotiate further with David Cameron. Gordon, he said, I'll tell you what's happening, he said. I'm basically finding out how far I can push the Conservatives on Europe. I genuinely take to heart what you said about that. We need some sanity on Europe. We can't seek to renegotiate. I'm trying my best. Well, I think that may be the epitaph on his tombstone. I'm trying my best. Now, it's a coincidence that my book is out on the same day as we're launching Progress's campaign for a Labour majority. But it's a happy coincidence because the big argument of the book is that for those of us committed to progressive politics, to make Britain a fundamentally fairer and more prosperous society, there is no salvation in coalitions. We need a Labour majority, and the bigger the Labour majority, the better. The fundamental lesson of the last 3 coalition years is that there is no great virtue in having the Lib Dems in government if you want mainstream progressive policies. The Lib Dems have supported George Osborne every inch of the way, or rather every inch of the way down. As a party of government, the Lib Dems have shown themselves to be little more than a pressure group for constitutional reforms to benefit the Lib Dems. What we have essentially seen in the last 3 years is a full-on Tory government with huge amounts of time and energy devoted to constitutional reforms, which the Lib Dems proposed only for the Tories to subvert, plus random Lib Dem vetoes where Nick wants to try and show his standing up to Cameron. In 2 years' time, what we need is a one-nation Labour government without random Lib Dem vetoes and constitutional obsessions, when the priority should be getting the unemployed back to work, building houses and improving health and education. Now, when I was the thin controller in charge of the national train set, constantly trying to make it run on time, I used to say that my middle names were no complacency, and there could be no complacency whatever about our prospects in the next election. Here is a stark first fact of the day from Peter Kellner's paper, which he's published today. In the last 80 years since 1931, there has only been one government, one, which has failed to get re-elected at least once. That was the Heath government of 1970. Now, this government and its Prime Minister bear a more than passing resemblance to the Heath government. Weak and disoriented in the face of economic crisis, constant U-turns, deepening crisis, all tactics, no strategy, 3 years in. But as the unsuccessful Labour government of 1974 to 79 showed, even if a very unpopular and incompetent government disintegrates in office and hands you power, you don't get very far without a strong, positive practical programme of your own, and my French friends are saying much the same today. So no complacency about the mountain to climb to win the 2015 election, and no complacency about the message and manifesto required both to win and to make a success of government thereafter. The campaign for a Labour majority, which Progress is launching today, therefore has two components to it. The first is a ground war for votes and seats. A key message of this month's council elections and the 2010 general election is the critical importance of the electoral battle, ward by ward and seat by seat. You know the sobering facts from 2010, that we polled 2 million fewer votes than the Tories nationwide, that we only won 10 out of 218 seats south of Birmingham outside London, that we won no seats whatever in 19 of the 25 counties of southern England. What did last Thursday's local elections show? We are clawing our way back. Take the three huge southern English counties of Essex, Kent and Hertfordshire, 46 parliamentary seats between them. In 1997, 18 were Labour. In 2010, Labour 0, Tory 45. Last Thursday, we won 37 county divisions across Essex, Kent and Hertfordshire. Almost all of them were gains, which is the great advance, but it was 37 out of 237. So the ground war matters. The lesson of 2010 is that the ground war matters in another way too. Great campaigns in individual seats can dramatically improve on the regional swing. Just consider what happened in nearby seats in 2010. Tooting up 0.8%, Battersea down 5.6%, Luton North up 0.7%, Bedford down 5.7%, Oxford East up 6.5%, Reading West and Swindon North both down 14.6%. Barking up 4.7%, Basildon South and Thurrock East down 9.7%. Barrow and Furness up 2.9%, Carlisle down 9.6%. In these key seats, and many more like them, Progress members are on the doorstep week in, week out, and we are particularly focusing on what we're calling the frontline 40 seats, which are crucial to gaining an overall majority. And this conference is the opportunity for us to discuss how to do it so that we mobilise as never before. The second component of the campaign for a Labour majority is progressive policy, so that in 2015 we are a credible and exciting alternative to the Tories, not simply the default party. Ed Miliband is absolutely right to champion One Nation. One Nation speaks the language of Middle England, North and South, middle class and working class, which wants more and better jobs, more and better housing, more and better opportunities for children and young people, more choice and higher standards in public services. In the context of low growth, high unemployment, which is the cycle we're in today, this means three things above all to get Britain moving. The first is a programme to get things built. Not just words on the page, but construction workers on the ground. 130,000 of them out of work today, who with interest rates at zero, while demand for infrastructure is huge, should be building tens of thousands more houses a year. The hundreds of new school buildings cancelled by the Tories in 2010. The essential trunk road upgrades cancelled by the Tories in 2010. The power infrastructure without which the lights will go out, but which the coalition still can't agree on. And yes, no speech from me will be complete without it. Also, HS2, transforming links between North and South, which 3 years after the publication of our HS2 plan in 2010, the Tories still haven't been able to turn into a bill, let alone a crane or a train. All this needs to be done. Massive dynamism and energy is needed in infrastructure to get Britain moving. The second key priority is to eradicate youth unemployment. Another stark statistic. The welfare bill for under 25s in Britain today is about £4.5 billion. Why is it £4.5 billion? Because more than a fifth of under 25s, 1 million young people, are either on the dole or economically inactive, as well as 1 million or more who, even in their mid-20s, are working part-time and or are very low paid. The waste and neglect starts the day that teenagers leave school. About a third of 18-year-olds go straight onto higher education. By and large, they get good qualifications and good jobs, and it works out for them. But for every 3 university students aged 18 or 19 in Britain today, there is only 1 apprentice, and at the last count, there were 153,000 16 to 18-year-olds categorised as not in education, employment or training. That is 153,000 teenagers going straight from school to the dole or doing nothing to learn or earn. The root of the problem is very simple. Last year, only 129,000 under-19s started an apprenticeship, and that number, incredibly, is falling. There are many reasons why there are so few youth apprentices. School standards still aren't high enough. Work experience opportunities for school pupils are scarce and becoming scarcer. Only a small minority of employers offer apprenticeships of any kind, and an even smaller proportion take on school leavers. The public sector is as bad as the private sector in its failure to recruit youth apprenticeships. It doesn't even use the billions it spends on procurement to create apprenticeships systematically, let alone creating them itself. The National Agency for Apprenticeships is weak, yet it holds all the funding while local authorities are disempowered, and the new local enterprise partnerships are little more than shells. Put all this together, and it is a textbook case of state failure, causing colossal social and economic damage, as well as millions of wasted lives. And it needn't be like this. If the state was properly organised and properly led, there is no reason why, in fairly short order, we could not treble the number of youth apprenticeships, so that for every school leaver, there are as many apprenticeship places as university places, slashing youth unemployment and the welfare bill together. To do this requires a plan of campaign, a radically stronger and more effective government, driving radically stronger and more effective partnerships between public and private sector, national and local government, schools and employers, young and old, all of it driven forward not only by leadership, policy and funding, but by a profound moral purpose to eradicate youth unemployment in this country. And this moral passion to eradicate youth unemployment should be at the heart of One Nation Labour. Yes, we've got to be fiscally responsible, and we will be, more so than this government, which is fast increasing debt and welfare because it is fast increasing unemployment and inactivity, and doing so little about low pay. Tackling low pay is a third key priority for getting Britain moving. And let me give you a final stark statistic. In the last 3 years, the minimum wage has gone up by 38p. 38p in 3 years, less than the price of a pint of milk. If we made work pay better, and I'm not talking about clowns and circuses or even the living wage, just something appreciably better than £6.31 an hour, then by this means too, work for the individual would be more productive and rewarding, and welfare bills would fall. I think it's well worth the party considering itself making a submission to the Low Pay Commission, calling for a reasonable increase in the minimum wage to make work pay and to cut welfare. So, infrastructure, youth unemployment, low pay, it is action, not austerity, that will get Britain moving, and a credible plan of action to get Britain moving is the fuel in the tank of the campaign for a Labour majority in 2015. That's why we're here today, and that, I believe, is how we will be campaigning from now to election day 2015 to elect a majority Labour government. Thank you very much. We now go straight into our first plenary session, where we have a star-studded cast that literally needs no introduction. Peter Kellner, I think you've been reading all morning, if not in the months and years he's been writing about elections and polls. And he's going to start us off. Peter.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. A few weeks ago, I was trekking in the Himalayas. Ahead of this, I decided to get some preparation done. So I lost weight, did exercise, started running up escalators on the underground. I bought myself a really good, sturdy pair of trekking boots. One of the other people on the trek, less than half my age, reckoned she was fit. She had done no preparation. She arrived in trainers and the trekking defeated her. I think the moral, I hope the moral of what I've just said is reasonably clear. That if we approach the next election as if we're match fit, it's going to be a walk in the park, we just carry on as we are, we're going to crash. And the reason I'd like to think that my piece for progress, which was reported in yesterday's Guardian, is not as negative as I know some comrades feel, is that actually I'm giving Labour a warning that it's got to get match fit, it's got to prepare. And if we approach the next election, and I repeat the metaphor that Andrew's already used of a mountain, if we think we can just go on and put on our trainers and stroll up to the mountain top, we'll not get there. We have to get match fit, we have to get our trekking boots on. And we need therefore to understand exactly what the scale of the mountain is and what the terrain is like. Because I have to say, at the moment, I do not think Labour is heading for victory. We're 8 or 9 points ahead in our YouGov surveys. It was 10 or 11. It dipped a bit after Thatcher's death to 7% or so. It's fractionally above that. Now, on a uniform swing calculation, we need a 1% lead in the popular vote to have an overall majority. I think that's misleading. For reasons I go into in my essay, I actually think we need a lead of getting on for 7 points in the national share of the vote to be reasonably sure of an overall majority of 1, and perhaps 8, 9, 10% leads to have a really good working majority. And given that the normal practice of past parliaments is for the opposition party to slip back and for the main governing party to gain in the months leading up to an election, the fact that we've got nothing to fall back on in terms of our lead, if Labour's to win outright next time, I think is concerning. So the beginning of wisdom, it seems to me, for planning victory in the next election is to understand that we're not in nearly as good a place as we should be, certainly not nearly as good a place in terms of the electorate as we were, let's say, in 1995, 96. That said, what do we do? I'm going to go through briefly, very briefly, the 6 points I mentioned at the end of my essay for any of you who've not quite got that far, because it goes over a number of pages, and I'm going to add a 7th, which isn't there. Point 1. Labour needs to hold on to the great majority of voters that have switched from Lib Dem to Labour since the last election. The reason we're ahead at all is principally because the Lib Dem vote has halved, and the great majority of the Lib Dem losses have come to Labour. Unlike the mid-90s, there are very, very few people switching from Conservative to Labour. So, for every vote the Lib Dems pull back is going to be bad news for the Labour Party. Secondly, Labour has to convince voters, as it hasn't yet, 3 years of a flatlining economy into this Parliament, that the Conservatives bear more of the blame for Britain's current economic plight than the last Labour government. Whenever we ask about blame, the figures remain stubbornly static. Quite a few people blame both parties, but of those who blame one, significantly more continue to blame the last Labour government, the present Conservative government. And I think it should be very concerning that the figures are not very different now from where they were a couple of years ago, when there was a general prospect that the economy would recover. The fact that we've had 2 years more of flatlining, and yet the blame figures haven't shifted, I think that's pretty serious stuff. This segues into point 3. Labour must assure voters that it has learned from the mistakes it made last time. And the beginning of that is to be clear what we think those mistakes are on the economy, on bank regulation, on social policy, and so on. Fourthly, Ed Miliband must convince voters that he would make a competent Prime Minister who's able to take tough decisions. I'm not arguing here for 1 minute that he lacks those qualities. I think he'd make a really good Prime Minister. I think he would take the tough decisions. but the public don't think so. And again, the figures haven't been shifting. He's stuck on most leadership attributes pretty well where he was a couple of years ago, just 3 or 4 months after he became leader. Fifthly, Labour needs to reassure those Tory voters who are now switching to UKIP that they have little to fear from a Labour government. One of the blindingly obvious things, and I offer this thought to number 10 without them having to pay me what they're paying Linton Crosby, that at the core of their election, or one of the key messages that they will put forward for the next election is to people who are thinking about UKIP, a vote for UKIP is a vote for Ed Miliband. And they will seek to frighten people in a way they can't at local elections, they won't be able to at next year's European elections. They're going to frighten those people into saying when it comes to a choice of government that a UKIP vote is a tantamount to a vote for Labour. Now, arithmetically, we can't counter that because plainly it is at least half a vote for Labour. It pulls votes away from the Tories and Tory Labour marginals. But what we can do is try to persuade those UKIP voters that it wouldn't be a nightmare if Ed Miliband were Prime Minister. And remember the failure of the Tories' demonised campaign before the 97 election. They were trying to frighten people away from voting Labour, and the point is that was an utterly disastrous campaign because people didn't believe it. Nobody, or very few people, were afraid of Tony Blair. Well, we've got to establish that same sense of reassurance, even for people who don't share our political values, because then that makes the Tory charge, a vote for UKIP is a vote for Miliband, it'll make that less effective. Sixth, and this is repeat something Andrew has just said, we need to win the ground war. And we did pretty well in the last general election, and spectacularly so in a number of particular seats, where they had the effort and they had the smartness to do this really properly. This was to be rolled out far more generally. Those are the six. And let me make a seventh point, and then I'll stop, which is don't be seduced by polls, even YouGov polls, which make you think that maybe a more populist approach to crime or to immigration or to Europe will win votes. I simply don't believe it's true. And I'm not here arguing the rights and wrongs of policy. I'm talking about the electoral mechanics of deciding, of considering your policy, your platform. Because there is no way a Labour leadership, or for that matter, in my view, a Conservative leadership, can chase far enough to the right to satisfy those people who really do want what most of us, or all of us here in this room, would regard as unpleasantly right-wing policies on crime or immigration or on Europe. And the appearance of trimming to that mood will give the appearance that we're vacillating, that we're cynical, that we're insincere. If and when we choose as a party quite consciously to hold views and values that are not majority values, it is far better to be clear about them and to get marks for honesty and integrity than it is to trim. I'm not saying, you go out of your way to offend people's values. But if we think that the way to cut crime is to have a different kind of prison regime which leads to fewer reoffences, if we believe that sensible immigration controls will produce really the right scale of immigration, the right people coming here, and that this is really good for Britain, economically and socially. If we think that the worst thing that could happen to Britain is to go through years of doubt as to whether our future is in Europe, we need to stand up for what we believe. So on last year, it's my final sentence, specifically on Europe, I'm delighted that the leadership has said no referendum. And if Harriet and her colleagues attempted in the run-up to the election to soften on that, I say, if you end up at the election offering a referendum because you think that'll win you votes, it won't. It'll lose you votes doing the right thing is also electorally the more effective thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. A great Methodist preacher friend of mine once told me no one ever remembers a sermon that makes more than 3 points. So I've got some ideas for which of the other 4 I might drop from Peter's list. But Phil, are you going to be able to keep it to 3 points? Phil Collins, columnist and chief lead writer on The Times.
Andrew, thank you very much. Well, Peter's already told you the problem in its entirety, and Andrew's already told you the solution, so I think we're more or less finished. I love doing this conference because I'm often cast on these things as the sort of pantomime villain who will tell you how miserable things really are. And last year I did a characteristically grisly presentation about how bad things were. And immediately afterwards, somebody buttonholed me in the corner and said, "I want a word with you." I thought that was complete nonsense. I thought, oh, here we go. And then she said, "It's much worse than you think." So I hope to offer the same cheery spirit this morning. Actually, what I want to do is just to talk about what I think are the unchanging facts of politics and offer you 3 things which might be helpful to answer the question, how does Labour win the next election? The essential fact of politics was crystallised for me the other morning when I listen. I have a great vantage point where I can listen to Tim Montgomery and Danny Finkelstein arguing about the future of the Conservative Party. And I bring you this intelligence from behind the wall because the argument they had reminded me absolutely of the argument I always have with Team Ed about the nature of politics. And Tim Montgomery's argument went as follows, that there has been, since 2008, a fundamental shift in politics, that the banking crisis has changed everything, and that everybody now is ready for something different. The old politics, the old era that started with Thatcher and culminated with Blair and Brown has come to an end. Cameron is a fag end of that intellectual period, and that politics requires something entirely different. Remarkably, exactly the same analysis that I hear from Team Ed, but the conclusions they come to are diametrically opposite. Both of them, as Danny said to Tim, as I always say, are indulging in the fantasy that the world has fundamentally altered and miraculously everybody now agrees with them. This is always a temptation in politics, and it's almost always true. Even if 50 years hence, some latter-day Andrew Adonis, the great historian of his era, says it was actually a great moment, an inflection point. There was a great historical period begun around about 2008. Nobody lives their life like that now. That's not how it feels. I've written before that nobody in the Middle Ages was sitting there thinking, oh, it's rubbish this, let's just wait till the Renaissance comes along. You live in your life, and the things that bother you are the things that bother people 10 years ago. So politics has not fundamentally changed, and this is the terrain on which so much argument is constructed. I think it's a fantasy. Second fact of politics is the Liberal Democrats have proved to be much more redoubtable than you thought they would. Their vote was much more resilient in the local elections, and they, as politicians, have proved to be more formidable opponents than anybody thought they would be. Not all of them, but they haven't crumbled in the way you thought they might. It's a very interesting fact about them, but they haven't. Thirdly, Labour keeps apologising for everything except the thing that's dragging its vote down, which is the conception that people have about its economic credibility, to which I'll return. Fourth, politics is deadlocked. There's been a lot of talk about whether the Labour Party is running a 35% vote strategy. I don't think they're running a 35% vote strategy. I don't think it's anywhere near that much. I think politics has gone back to its core. So the Tories are finding it very hard to break out of where they're very deeply entrenched, Labour likewise, and oddly enough, Liberal Democrats now the same. The Tory modernisation was so incomplete. Just imagine if the Tories had had the vision to support AV. They wouldn't need to worry about UKIP anymore, and they'd have the boundary changes. It would be a fundamentally different political landscape. I, the other day, wrote a column on Alan Johnson's book, which I recommend to all of you. And it was a great lesson in that it's nice, although it runs against the grain of being a newspaper columnist, to write something that's just generous about somebody for once. And I got a great reaction from it. And the thing that I took from it is two things which are relevant. One is that it is still important that the Labour Party's links to the trade unions brings people through in politics. That's a link to ordinary people. And the second thing is about politics itself, that conversation and pleasant dissent, of which Alan absolutely embodies, is part of politics. And it's a very important point for my first piece of advice for what I think needs to happen in order for Labour to win, which is that there is a fight going on in the Labour Party. It is often said that Tony Blair used to like to pick fights for the sheer joy of it, or for an exhibition of his strength against the trade unions. I don't think that was ever true. I think right now a fight has been picked which you're in anyway, whether you like it or not. And I don't want the Labour Party leader to get his retaliation in first. I want him to get it in second. Because Len McCluskey's call for this organisation to be expunged is a sort of politics which is disgraceful and disreputable. Now, I know that's an easy thing to clap at this audience, and that it wasn't just for that reason that I said it. I also said it is because it's an exhibition of the type of public leadership that the leader needs to exhibit in order to change the perception that Peter has just taken us through. There are other ways of doing it too, but that is one which is current and it needs to be taken on. Because otherwise, I fear that imaginative members of the Shadow Cabinet don't have air cover for changes and reforms they'd like to offer. I often receive these sort of fugitive emails from Shadow Cabinet members showing me a speech they've done. And they more or less say, I did this speech at the Fabians, I hope nobody noticed, in which they smuggle through reform ideas, and they don't feel they have any cover. They don't feel that there's an intellectual flavour to the Labour Party, and they don't feel they're going to be sanctioned if they offer a strong reform message. And in an era in which there is no more money to spend for the foreseeable future, to reform the state, to govern the state in a more efficient manner is the task at hand. And if Labour cannot convince the public that they are capable of doing that, they will not convince the public to vote for them. This needs indicative policies, not detailed policies, but it needs policies that offer a flavour. And it was disheartening to see people being forced to go out into the local election campaigns and knock on doors and talk to people about regional banks. It's not that I'm against regional banks, it's just that I'm paid to have an opinion. I'm the chief lead writer of the Times. If I don't have an opinion about regional banks, then nobody does. It's not so much left wing as left field. It's the equivalent of the big society. It will suffer the same fate on the doorstep. It's not the kind of indicative policy that tells you what sort of government you're going to be. But the really big question was raised in the interview that we'll call Pulling Teeth with Martha. That failure in that interview was not a question of technique. It was a substantive flaw was revealed in the Labour Party's position on the economy. Ed was very reluctant to admit, even though it's obvious from what he'd said, that Labour would spend more than the Conservatives. Why was he so reluctant when it was so obvious? Because he knows, his political antennae are so attuned, so he knows that the public don't trust Labour on spending. Therefore, he was very reluctant to concede what was already obvious. That question has to be dealt with. At the moment, it seems to me Shadow Cabinet members are licensed to oppose cuts all the time. I remember back fondly now the days when Gordon Brown refused to say the word cuts. Now the Shadow Cabinet won't stop saying it. There has to be a change in this economic policy, otherwise it's impossible to gather the credibility that will be required in order to be a viable government. How do you do that? I don't think it's a straightforward question of matching the spending cuts. I think that would look like too much political chicanery. I don't think it's the right policy either, so that wouldn't be believed. But some credible plans about what austerity is going to look like under Labour, because despite plans to get things moving, there will still be cuts. It's inevitable. It can't be avoided. And a sense of that check with reality is missing at the moment from the way people perceive the Labour Party. The idea that when you get into government, it's going to be horrible and hard, and yet you're prepared to do it. That's still lacking. So the thing that worries me most, and I'll conclude with this, is not really that you don't win, but that you do. Because Labour's not ready for it. Labour has not steeled itself for what it's going to have to do. A £12 billion stimulus plan in a £1.5 trillion economy is not a viable answer to the question of economic credibility. And if the Tories are as bad as Ed is going to tell you that they are later today, then he ought to win. But at the moment, he's not doing enough to win. So there's three things he has to do, I think. One is increase the capacity in his leadership. Two is have a reform message about how Labour is going to run the state. And three, overriding all of it, is to regain economic credibility. Without that, I think it's going to be very difficult.
Thanks very much, Phil. Andy Harrop, General Secretary of the Fabian Society. Middle Ages, Renaissance or Reformation?
Well, let me first of all start by welcoming the launch of Progress's campaign for a Labour majority. It's a bit of a stereotype about the difference between Progress and the Fabians, that you've started a big ground war campaign. We've got a programme called Labour's Next Majority, which does analysis, research, discussion, a bit of networking. You're actually going out and doing it, so well done. I completely agree with the points that both Andrew and Phil have made, that it is as important to talk about what sort of government Labour will be after 2015 as how we win. Both are essential questions. And I want to start with the what sort of government we want to be, because it actually constrains and shapes the sorts of choices we make about how we win a majority. We have an incredibly difficult tightrope to cross, the sort of tightrope that comrades on the continent have failed to cross. Think about the French socialists, think about PASOK. How do we get a combination of credibility, competence, maybe even reassurance, but also offer optimism, change, a sense of agency, a belief that actually, if you vote Labour, it will make a difference, rather than just being more of the same. And I think that finding that balance is going to be the biggest challenge for us in terms of our political programme. And it very much links to some of the issues that have already been discussed about, you know, how people perceive the Labour Party. We need to say very clearly what we will do and take on some of the issues where we do have red lines, and I agree with Peter on some of those cultural politics issues, but also on spending. If we believe that what George Osborne is doing on spending is wrong for the country, we have to set out an alternative. But as Phil has said, it needs to be a credible alternative that lists where cuts will have to fall, rather than a sort of a Francois Hollande sort of a scenario where you say one thing but actually you end up doing another, which people just won't believe anyway. We need to explain that there are choices. It's not true, as Osborne says, there is no alternative, but they're highly constrained choices, and we will take responsible decisions if we get back in. And I think that sort of honesty is the route towards all the sort of the issues Peter's talked about, in terms of there not being enough trust and support in Labour and in Ed. So let me turn to the question of how do we win our majority. We need to start from where we are. And that's a statement of the obvious. Ideally, we'd like to have more people mid-term saying they're going to vote Labour, but we don't. And actually, if people are currently saying they're going to vote Tory or they're going to vote Lib Dem, given where we are with the economy, given the unpopularity of both parties, is it likely that many of them are going to shift over the next 2 years? Well, frankly, no. So let's look at the people who are available to us. Start from where we are in the polls at the moment. And there's actually some reasonably positive news, absolutely no grounds for complacency, but there are enough people out there who are our potential supporters, our potential considerers, for us to win a healthy majority. A lot of them say they have completely made up their mind that they're going to vote Labour. Not all, and also you can't take those sorts of midterm questions too seriously, but there is a stickability about people's current voting intentions. And also, a lot of those people lean towards the left in terms of their views on the economy and on public services, not necessarily on those cultural issues that Peter talked about. The reason that is sort of fascinating, when you look at the polls, you actually see that our support in 2010 and our new support that we've acquired since actually line up on all the issues, like, views on the role of public services, views on, the economy and, how left we should be on economic issues. We don't have a sort of a left-wing 2010 rump and a more right-wing group who have come to us since. Actually, their views are very similar. So we need to reach out to all of them. Now, Clearly there are fewer, and Peter says it very articulately in his article, clearly there are far fewer people than in the past who are switching between the broad left and the broad right. And that is the main reason why we haven't got higher polling than we would like. But it also may be grounds for optimism that, we failed to win as many Tories as we would like. But that also means there are fewer Tories out there to go back to David Cameron as the election follows. There is, a few, but actually the task in hand is not stopping a large rump of Conservatives who have come over to us but are likely to go back. It's keeping a much more diverse package of new supporters together, most of whom have not recently voted Conservative. So who are they? Who are the people, particularly in the marginals, who we need to vote Labour in 2015? A bit under half of our new supporters are Liberal Democrats, the 2010 Liberal Democrats, which is, of course, a huge amount, essential for victory, but it's not the whole story either. So don't get carried away with the Liberal Democrats. The next biggest group is new voters, people who either first-time voters, young people, or people who just stopped voting. Maybe they were people who voted for us in the 90s and early 2000s and gave up on us. But there are a very large group of people who didn't vote in 2010, who are currently saying they will vote Labour. Of course, that's a massive challenge for us in terms of converting that current intention into a ballot. And then there is a sliver of former Conservatives. And as Progress publications have made clear, to do well in the sorts of marginals that are required for a good majority, a working majority, we do need Conservatives. We just don't need that many compared to how we used to fight elections. So some Conservatives are essential, but we mustn't refight old wars where it was really a fight between Labour and the Conservatives, and the swing between those two parties was essential. So how do we get those new supporters we need? We need to have a very strong ground war, as Peter and others have said, and we need a big national offer in terms of our national politics. The ground war, I would argue, should be highly segmented, thinking about the different backgrounds, the different concerns of the voter groups that you find in each of your patches locally. We need to reach out to those people who have given up on politics, or the young people who have never switched on, the new voters, and that's where the community politics agenda of the party is so important. Be that from community organising, the sort of the work that Arnie Graf has been doing, through to registration, which of course is going to be increasingly important, not just for this election, but going forward with the new registration system. But we need to redouble our efforts on traditional campaigning as well. Voter ID is essential. It's not just about which party is your first preference party. It's about whether you prefer a Labour-led government or a Tory-led government. That's the dividing line in terms of squeezing the broad left to make the same point that Peter made about UKIP, the choices between Labour and Conservative. Anyone who would prefer a Labour-led government, we need to squeeze so they come to us. And then the final ingredient, which is about those small but very important number of Conservatives who have switched over to us, who are considering us. Of course, a lot of that is about the national campaign and national politics, but there's also an awful lot that candidates can do individually. If you know where they are in your marginal seat, the key, one of the key ways you can win them over is building that relationship. There's only 500 to 1,000 of them in each seat, those Conservative switchers. So go and find them and get to know them. But returning to our national offer shouldn't be highly segmented in that way a local campaign be, because the sorts of things that will make up the minds of both ex-Lib Dems, people who've given up on politics, and Conservatives are broadly the same things. It's about trust and competence. It's not really a left or right thing. It's not about how left or right we go. It's about how credible and how much strength people see that we have as a potential government. And I would agree with Phil, although I'm more optimistic about our party's ability to deliver it, that we need a handful of very strong policies that are emblematic of the change we can bring. The sorts of policies we're talking about have got to be big in scale, the sorts of things that you just can't forget, sorts of policies like building 1 million homes, so memorable that you can't forget it. And we need to be totally clear and tough and open about those policies, including difficult areas like spending, so that we aren't seen as trimming around the edges. It's how we talk about our policies, as well as those really big ideas, that will make the difference, which takes me back to where I started. We need to have a programme of government, not just a plan to win. This might be, as Peter has argued, a 1972 moment, where we all know what happened after the 1974 Labour government, which was an era of Conservative rule. We need a government, if we get back in, that does so well that we don't open the way to a reaction that leads to the right getting in 2020. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. And finally, Renaissance woman Harriet Harman.
Right, thanks very much indeed, Andrew, and thanks to Progress for bringing us all together at this very important time and for the continuing work that Progress does. And thanks for inviting me to be here so I can take on what I think is the Aunt Sally of this argument that we are beset with too much complacency. Are you complacent? Does anybody here think that we are a shoo-in for government, and the problem is that we're all sitting back doing the equivalent of what Peter said about the woman with her trainers who didn't do any practice in Everest? When I go around the country, I don't meet any party members who are saying, it's great, isn't it? We're an absolute shoo-in. I don't meet any councillors or councillor candidates who are saying, you know, I'm looking forward to being a councillor, I'm a dead cert, and then we're a dead cert to be in government. I just don't see that around. And I don't see amongst our MPs the idea, of whom many are here today, which is great. I don't see amongst our Labour MPs the idea that, that we're going to be an automatic shoo-in. So I don't think at all our problem is complacency and not realising the scale of the task. I think everybody felt that shock after 2010 when we got resolutely kicked out. That has a massive impact. That does not generate complacency. It generates a real sense of worry, anxiety and concern. Everybody knows that what the Tories and the Lib Dems were going to do was blame us for the economic impact on people's lives of the global financial crisis. Everybody actually knows that. And everybody knows too that when a government has got elected, albeit it's a coalition government, there is a sense amongst the voters that they should be given a chance. The voters like to kind of back their own judgment for a bit, and therefore everybody knows that it is a very big task to get in again when you were kicked out last time. So I think that actually there isn't any complacency around, but I think that we have to be absolutely sure that we don't be defeatist. I think the problem is not complacency, it's actually defeatism. And I'm glad that actually after what was very encouraging local election campaigns and local election results, there is much more of a sense of optimism in the party that it is possible and we can do it. So that's what I would say that our stance should be, is that it is not inevitable we should get into government, but it is possible we should get into government. We are not observers of a world which is shaped by others. We are participants. And if we're certain that though it's not inevitable, it is possible, that shapes what we actually do and our fight to actually make it happen. Not to sit back and to say the history will repeat itself, but to say the future requires us to fight to get in. So I think the local election results were encouraging. We had more candidates than we've had before. That is very important indeed. I don't believe in pioneer, paper candidates, as it's called. You know, I'm standing just as a paper candidate. I think everyone who stands with a Labour ticket is actually a pioneer candidate. They're standing up for Labour and letting people have the opportunity to vote Labour in many areas where they haven't before. And we've got new councillors in areas where we haven't before. And that is incredibly important. Because every time you've got a Labour councillor who's taken a seat off an independent or a Tory or a Lib Dem, that is not only somebody who is there, you know, carrying the Labour flag, interacting with their local community, but also there is a defeated Tory or a Lib Dem, you know, who is furious and demoralised. And therefore, our councillor base is really important, not only for what they're actually doing standing up for their local communities in councils where we run the council or even where they're in a minority, but because they are pushing back the Tory base, and that's very important indeed. As far as our candidates is concerned, we've got actually, at a time when people feel that politicians don't understand their lives, they live on a different planet, they're all the same, that brings me to the point about who our candidates are and who our representatives are. The reality is that we have more diverse and representatives than all the other parties put together. We've got more women in Parliament, Labour women, than all the other parties put together. We've got more minority ethnic candidates than all the other parties put together. We've got more candidates from a working class manual background. We've got, more MPs than all the other parties put together. But still, we need to make progress on all those fronts so people see a team of people speaking up for and representing Labour who they feel might have some glimmer of understanding of what's actually happening in their lives. When we had hundreds of women candidates in the 97 election, it simply dealt with the argument that Labour was a men-only party. How could it be? Look at the candidates. And therefore, I think that all of you and all of us who are in selection, making choices in selections, it's really worth thinking not only who is the best candidate for you, for your area, but how you're going to contribute to that team in Parliament. And I went along to a Chulo summer school, trade unions summer school, for their promotion of their candidates, and met 20 of the candidates that are on their summer school. And they were a postman, GP practice manager, a woman who's a product line manager for Tesco, people in ordinary different jobs. And actually, when people know, and if we select people like that to be their representatives in Parliament, that is very important indeed. So I think the work of the Future Candidates programme is very important too. Finally, it's absolutely right that we have to have an exciting, credible policy offer. And I think that we should back up the credible and important policies we've already got. The compulsory jobs guarantee, financed out of cutting tax relief for pension contributions for people earning over £150,000. Therefore, people who've been unemployed for more than 2 years, to guarantee them a job and to require them to do it. That is an incredibly important policy. And that part of the compulsory jobs guarantee, which says if a young person has been unemployed for more than 12 months, they will have a job and it will be financed out of repeating the banker's bonus tax. We must argue behind those policies. They are incredibly important and touch people's concerns. But also, we need to listen to what people are saying they want the policies to be. So, for example, as well as pushing forward and developing our policy on childcare, we're having discussions all around the country with older women, women who are actually caring for their grandchildren, looking after even older relatives who are carrying on working longer than they thought they would be, who are actually the first generation of women in their families who've actually worked throughout their lives, and actually talking about the policies that they want to bring forward. And Emma Lowell-Buck, who was our new MP for South Shields, she had 5 pledges. Well, she had 4 very good pledges for South Shields, and her 5th one was, what do you want to be my pledge, my 5th pledge that I will deliver to you? So we do need dynamic, credible, exciting policies, but we must actually not assume that we sit in rooms of clever people working out what these are. We've got to listen to what actually people want. And I think finally, on the note of confidence, my final point is this, is that the Tories and the Lib Dems are in a very bad way. It doesn't change anything about what I said about the difficulty, and we all know the difficulty of getting back in, but there was a by-election in Oldham on Thursday. The Tories had been in second place, we won, but the Tories had previously been in second place. Their vote went from 34% down to 4%. And that is happening because of the effect of UKIP on them, is creating an absolute sense of panic in them. The Lib Dems are strong in the areas where they've got MPs and where they've long had council representation, but where they haven't got that dug-in organisation, they are simply being really, really degraded. So therefore the average in relation to Lib Dems doesn't tell you a huge amount. But the other thing finally which is happening, this is my absolute last point, is that in the House of Commons it is very interesting. Of course we know they've got the wrong values and they're heading in the wrong direction and everything is wrong about the Tories in government. But what is really significant is that the government, the ministers, the Prime Minister, are so hexed by the difficulty of the Lib Dems as we get nearer to the general election, wanting to differentiate themselves and moving away from the sense of the importance of the coalition for their sort of political mission, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Tory backbenchers hexed and reinvigorated by UKIP, that Cameron is effectively paralysed. I don't know whether he's run out of ideas, whether he's got any ideas or not. He has not got any ability to deliver anything, and all the political energy is drained in dealing with the Lib Dems and his backbenchers. Combine that with a complete hollowing out of the civil service, so you've got no infrastructure in government to be taking forward new ideas, and government has virtually ground to a halt. That doesn't mean that we automatically take over in 2015, but it does mean that we have an even greater responsibility to do everything that we can and need to do between 2015 to make our determination that we get into government a reality.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Harriet. Well, my timetable tells me that the next train departs in 7 minutes, which is a slight problem if we're going to have a Q&A. What I think I'm going to do is to unilaterally delay the start of the next section by 10 minutes and take one very substantial round of questions and then have one response by the panel at the end. Otherwise, we're never going to get onto the train at any time. Can I start on the front row and then Sally on the second row? Please, I think there is, I don't know if there's a microphone coming. I think you just need to speak up, please.
Thank you. My name is Carl Wallace. I'm from Dorset. I was a former Lib Dem. And I've come across to Labour because you're the only guys that are doing anything. Now, the big problem that I find down in my patch, which is predominantly Lib Dem, as you pointed out there, dug in, is we need to identify our members. Who is going to support us? I feel that the current mechanism for canvassing is very reduced. I mean, we don't know who the soft Tories are. We don't know who's going to actually vote. You know, if at all. So I feel that we need to look at how to identify our basic voters.
Thank you very much, Sally.
Councillor Sally Prentice from Lambeth. My question to the panel is, how are we going to persuade people who take very little interest in politics, who work in the private sector and live in the south of England in the seats that we need to win, that they can trust a future Labour government with their money when their living standards are declining?
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, please, and then towards the back.
Martin Phillips and Guildford. I'm also a member of the National Policy Forum. I'm on the Economic Commission that deals with the regional banks, and I can tell Phil all about it if he wants to know. I think we'll win a majority if we give people hope. And I think at the moment the problem is all three parties, sadly including ours, are more worried about, more dominated by the fear of losing than wanting to win. And I think that's a problem. Harriet mentioned the backlash after the 2010 defeat. And I think that's absolutely right. A lot of the MPs I know were really shell-shocked by it. And I think we're not going to win a majority unless we deal with the big question, which is the economy. And it's not the technical stuff. People don't sit in pubs debating what the size of the deficit should be. They want to know, is somebody going to give me hope that my pay will go up faster than inflation next year? Or is somebody going to do something about the 4 big costs of life? And these are things Labour really failed on in government, because we allowed food prices, energy prices, fuel prices and housing prices to go up. And that's why we've got the squeezed middle. We failed in government to deal with that. And I fear, as I said, I'm a member of the Economic Policy Commission, I can't tell you what our policies are going to be to start tackling those big price increases. And until we do that, I don't think we're going to be in a majority. I think we're going to have a situation where we waver between parties.
Thank you. Towards the back, yeah,
Hey.
please.
Yeah, this is a question for Peter, but anyone can answer it if they like. The UKIP surge, is it a blessing or a curse?
Yeah, just across the aisle, the gentleman in the brown jacket. Yeah, please.
Stuart Maydor from Tower Hamlets. I hear Harriet saying that she's not complacent. From where I'm sitting, all I can see from the National Executive, from Harriet in particular, complacency. The party was complacent about Bradford. They assumed they were going to win, and they got a very big shock. They are still complacent about the situation in Tower Hamlets. They refuse to do anything about it, and they will get a very nasty shock unless they do something about it quickly. But Harriet has got to own up, confess up, and realise the mistake she's made.
Thank you very much. There's a lady right at the very back, seeking to catch mine, and then a gentleman on the front row.
Hi, Joanna Baxter from the National Executive Committee. Just wanted to say to our colleague that the National Executive is anything but complacent. And I just wondered if the panel could say a little bit about the changes that we're making to the party to make sure that our constituencies up and down the country are well resourced and able to ensure that we're not doing just voter ID or just community organising, but both of those things together, which ensures that we have a deeper conversation with the electorate and that we're fully involved and engaged in our communities across the country. We need both of those things if we're going to engage all of those non-voters, because actually one of our biggest problems are people who are completely disenfranchised with politics.
Thank you very much. The gentleman on the front, and then the lady 2 rows back here.
Mohammed, Bangladesh, from Ilford North. Come hell or high water, we must win the election. There is no ifs and buts. It's not good enough to rely. It's not good enough to rely on the MPs and councillors. Every members of the party should have personal commitment that we must win the election. Without power, you cannot do anything, no matter what kind of good policies you may have, what kind of leader you may have, you got to have power. So we are after power, and we shall win the election by hook or crook. Bye for now.
Well, I think we're going to win it plain and fair and square, not by hook or crook. Let's not mix our metaphors. The lady here, and then the gentleman on the second row.
Hi, I'm Claire Lee. I'm chair of Tonbridge Morling CLP. We've recently just realised that the UK has narrowly avoided a triple-dip recession, and I think the IMF are even revising whether we went into a double-dip recession last year. I wonder whether the panel could talk to the fact that we might be entering a situation in 2015 where there are early signs of economic recovery. How do we proof our narrative against signs of economic recovery, and how do we vary the narrative to account for that? Thank you.
Can I take the gentleman in the second row, then the one next to him, and then I'll take 3 more, the lady here, and then the 2 gentlemen on either side. Is that all right?
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, Chris Evans. I'm a councillor from Newport in South Wales. We won 3 safe Conservative seats in the local elections last year. What more can we do to reach out to soft conservative voters. I don't think nationally we're doing enough. It's almost as if we're sort of just quite happy with the Liberal vote. And almost it seems to be particularly locally that it's frowned upon to reach out to soft Tory voters.
And next door, yep, please.
Hello, my name is Rahul Yacobi. I'm from Wolverhampton. Just want to ask a question that how Labour makes its policies understandable to the people in the street. How do they bring common sense to politics? Instead of talking abstract, they have to make sense to local people in the streets that this is what Labour stands for, this is our policy, like our friend mentioned about building 1 million homes. What about schools? What about healthcare? What about all other stuff that people really care for?
Thank you. The lady about halfway back, and then the two gentlemen on either side, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Hi, Susan Masters, East Ham CLP. It's a question to Harriet, really, about the compulsory jobs guarantee. I just feel this is probably one of the weakest policies I've heard coming out of Labour. I just think the financial and psychological impact of being unemployed for 2 years is so incredible. We just need a much earlier intervention. And also, if you look at the numbers of people who are actually employed longer than 2 years are absolutely minute. So I think we need to look at a much quicker intervention.
And then the last two, the gentleman on the other side of the aisle. Thanks. And then, yeah.
Thank you. Barry Kidson from Dulwich West Norwood. I'd just like to ask why the policy-making process is so opaque, haphazard, and ill-organised.
And then the final question, yes, please.
Yeah. My name is Paul Lusk from Telford and Wrekin. I love coming to Progress conferences. Thank you for all you're doing to promote an intelligent conversation among Labour supporters. Two things I'd like to hear responses on, not necessarily from the panel. One is welfare reform. I think this is an issue we are being hammered on. It's hammering our own core supporters, and it's an issue the Tories are using successfully as a dividing line. And what I'm hearing at grassroots is what is our alternative? What are our policies? I suspect this is something that's just been in the too hard tray since the first term of the Labour government, and it needs to be taken out of the too hard tray, and we need some policies. Second thing, fundamental thing on the economic credibility issue, I don't think it's really a matter of debt and deficit, which is a lot of smoke and mirrors a lot of the time, but I do think we need to address the question of the size of the state. From 97 for 10 years, we grew the state from 37% to 47% of GDP. We doubled public expenditure in cash terms. Fantastic achievement, and fantastic things grew from that. A lot of it was done by stealth. There was never really a clear public debate. I think the party needs, as a fundamental thing, to say what is the target for the size of the estate as a proportion of the national economy, because I do think it got too big.
Thank you very much. That was 15 questions. If all of my colleagues seek to answer all of them, we'll be here till lunchtime. So what I'm going to do is give each of you precisely 3 minutes to take as many or as few of these points as you like. Peter, let's start.
Right, the specific question was asked to me, UKIP, blessing or curse. It's double-edged. You know, short term, up to the next election electorally, it's a blessing because it divides the right-wing vote. It looks as if the right may be in the position that the left was in for much of the 20th century of having a divided vote. And if Ed Miliband does end up as Prime Minister, I suspect part of it will be the Tories have not been sufficiently successful in winning back UKIP supporters. However, as a citizen, I have to say, I think one of the great assets of British politics in my lifetime is that we've not had a successful far-right nationalist party, that the Conservative Party has been occupied enough of the space of the right to keep the really nasty nationalism utterly marginalised. So, looking to the I would like UKIP to retain the Tory vote through the next election, and after that to wither away and for us to return to a civilised Tory party that does monopolise the right of centre space. Second point, a lot of people mention policies. plainly, you need to have the right policies in much the same sense that a car has to have the right engineering. But if you're advertising a car, then on the whole, you don't talk in your adverts in too much detail about the metal alloy in the engine casing. You sell cars because you persuade people that you are the kind of car makers that get these things right. Okay? So we've got to have the right policies, just as cars have to have the right engineering. But the way you win votes is because floating voters, who don't on the whole follow policy in detail, they form a judgment. Are you up to the job? Are you straight? Are you tough? Will you keep your promises? Can I envisage you running the country? Those are the kinds of themes one has to get right. And so one very, very precise bit of advice is when Andrew or Harriet or any of our frontline politicians appear on radio or television, they've got to sound like their ministers. They've got to sound like they're people who tomorrow could do the job of running the country or of running a government department. The third point I'd make, and I'll come in, I think, hopefully well under your 3 minutes, I never use the word complacency in what I said earlier. I never do. I would certainly not accuse Harriet or anybody of being complacent. That's obviously not the case. But I have to say this, that we've had 2 references to successes in last week's local elections. If a national projected share of 29% is success, I hate to think what failure looks like. So, I want realism. I don't want complacency or defeatism. And realism means looking at the polling numbers, not just the headline numbers, but the underlying numbers such as are in my progress piece, looking at the local elections and working out what's wrong. Because if you don't work out what's wrong, you're not going to put them right.
Thanks very much, Peter. Phil?
Well, I'm tempted to just repeat that last point because so vital was it. But I'll start with Sally Prentice's question and work my way around the room for 3 minutes. Sally asks, how do you win back the trust of people who live in the south of east of England, who work in the private sector, and who have no great interest in politics? Well, that's me. So how do you win my trust back? Well, you win it back by being credible on the economy, by assuaging the sense that you can't wait to get your hands on my money to spend it on something. So I'm very attracted by the idea of the fifth pledge being left open for people. And I'd like to offer my fifth pledge, which is I won't do any of the 4 pledges above, because we haven't got any money to do them with. When Andrew was reading out the election results earlier, the local election results, and he said barking up 7.4%. I thought that's a really good tagline for the Labour Party policy review. We have to come back to the central question of economic credibility time and time again, because that is the permission to be heard. In actual fact, despite me being rude about it, there are good policies. There are perfectly good policies that Labour shadow ministers have got, but they don't have permission to be heard on them. And that's because there's this door through which Labour has not yet walked of economic credibility. And without that, I can't see any hearing for those policies, the merits of which we can argue about, but there's plenty of good ideas out there, but they will not be heard. It is true the Labour Party has to offer hope, but hope comes in different forms. At the moment, the hope that is required is not hope that everything's going to be marvellous, but hope that it won't be awful. It's a sort of reassurance that is required at the moment. And at the moment, Labour isn't offering that reassurance. Of all the many interesting things in Peter's work over the last couple of days, one thing that really struck my eye was when people are asked a forced question, which is to say, would you prefer a David Cameron-led Conservative government or an Ed Miliband-led Labour government? I think Labour had a lead of 1 point. I think it was 42-41. Now that, in conjunction with 29% of a national projected share at an actual election, is an alarming situation. So the point to come back to time and again is not that anybody's complacent. Nobody's accusing anybody of complacency. The accusation is not yet good enough, which is a much more difficult thing to counter. And the central question is what is the shape and size of the state after Labour gets hold of it. In 2005, Tony Blair wanted to conduct what he called a zero-based review, a fundamental savings review, to look at everything as if there were no public spending at all, but we had £600 billion to play with. What would we do with it? What shape would it take? Something of that kind needs to happen in Labour thinking. So there's a clear sense of, given the resources available, what would Labour do? I always think it's not true when people say there's no money. There's loads of money. It's just all accounted for. There's no more money. But a clear sense of what a Labour state would look like, how it would accord with the values that make Labour distinct from the Conservatives, is what needs to be done. It's by no means impossible, but no progress has yet been made.
Thanks, Phil. And Andy.
Well, the Fabians are trying to do something like that, Phil. We've got a commission on future spending choices, which John McFall is chairing, and it's the right question, but it's also a very hard question, because when you start looking at how we're spending our money, it is actually quite hard to peel away lots of things you just think, why on earth are we doing this? And it's very easy to find lots of things we think there's a very good case for spending more on, like childcare and elder care, which really takes me to the question of welfare reform, which I totally agree is a really hard one for us. But my view is the reason it's hard is because there is a mismatch between public perception and the reality of what is now a pretty tough, highly rationed welfare system. And I find it difficult to see how the left is going to find lots of ways of taking more money off the sorts of people that the tabloids like attacking. There are other groups we could take money off, like pensioners, but the sorts of people who get castigated, actually, we have a very tight system in terms of the amount of money they get and also the responsibilities that are placed on them, which takes me to the jobs guarantee. One of the important things about the jobs guarantee is an offer of work, but it's also an expectation you take the offer. And that's the sort of policy we need across the board, so that it's not just a sort of a, playing to the stereotypes of soft labour. It's giving people hope, but also a sense of, expectation that, people will take what opportunities are available to them. So that's a sort of little bit on policy. There was also a cluster of questions on party change. Has the party moved on in terms of a different sort of politics, in terms of how we do our policy review? And I think it depends whether you want to be glass half full or glass half empty. There has been a lot of good, formal rule changes. There's a lot of good intention from the top, but I think it's very patchy in terms of whether you see it at constituency level. Clearly resources are moving into target constituencies, but has there been a fundamental sort of shift in the mindsets of, everyone in the party, staff and volunteers? And I think it's definitely still work in progress. Final cluster of questions, of course, on the electoral politics that we've been focusing on. Coming back to Thursday clearly wasn't as good as we'd like it to be, but we know what sorts of seats it was. It was predominantly semi-rural, southern, and it was also a low turnout election. We need to remember that low turnout elections understate Labour's performance. But there were some grounds for concern we need to think about. The thing that concerned me about Thursday most was that we didn't see lots of Liberal Democrat switchers to Labour. So clearly in those sorts of marginals, more work to be done. But in the marginals we need to win, if you looked at Thursday's results, we basically got enough to just about get a majority. Not a good majority, not good enough, but there is clear signs of progress, even in a mediocre night for Labour. And finally, sort of thoughts on UKIP. UKIP, I agree about sort of Peter's concerns about UKIP potentially dragging British politics to the right. But clearly the sort of fraying of the right vote is helpful. UKIP is not just a right-wing party, it's also an anti-politics party. And we saw actually a lot of Lib Dems go and vote UKIP as well. The sorts of Lib Dems who used to vote Lib Dem because they hate politicians have now gone to UKIP. And I just offer you this glimmer of hope. I'm sure that UKIP's vote will fall a lot before the general election. But I'm not so convinced that all those votes will go to the Tories. I think we'll see what happened after 1992, which is a lot of Tories just sitting on their hands and not voting. But it's our job to make sure that happens, and that's why, as well as pooling together everyone we want to vote for us, we discredit this government day after day so that its support frays in every direction.
Thank you very much. And Harriet, last word's yours.
Finally, UKIP as a blessing or a curse. I think UKIP surge is a warning. I mean, like many people here, I talk to loads of people all around the country on the doorstep, people who previously voted Labour as well as previously voted Tory, who said they were going to go vote UKIP. And I think there was two things that I was left with very distinctly. One is as Andrew said, the sort of anti-politics, you're all the same, and people sometimes saying, you know, I know that it doesn't add up what they're saying, but I'm voting for them as a protest. So there's no doubt they did echo that sense that none of you can make any difference to the difficulties in my life. But there is also a very specific issue that people voting UKIP said they were voting UKIP because of, and that was the question of my job prospects, or the job prospects for young people in my family are undermined by the fact that if there are jobs, people will come over from Europe and take those jobs. So I think that the UKIP surge is a warning, and I think it is completely arid if anybody thinks, oh, well, it's good for us that UKIP is taking votes away from the Tories and that's how we're going to get in. That is absolutely not the way anybody should seek to win and govern the country. That is completely arid, looking at numbers. Secondly, the point about tax and spending. One of the important arguments that has emerged recently is the issue of the wholesale unfair evasion of people who should be paying their taxes, whether individuals, but above all multinational companies. And I really want to pay tribute to Margaret Hodge for really putting this on the agenda through the Public Accounts Committee. And, you know, it's not just hard-working people paying their taxes, fearing that we're going to throw the money down the drain. It's actually a whole load of people who are not actually contributing. So that is another agenda we must put forward. And finally, the issue about living standards. The question about living standards is not just dealing with the cost of transport, the cost of housing, the cost of energy, and all of those. You know, we've got to have credible and exciting policies going forward, but it's also the question of people's expectations for their pay in their job. And lying behind the unemployment figures are all those people who are in work but who want to be working full-time and are working part-time, so are earning less than they want to be earning, who are on 0 hours contracts, who don't actually know whether they're actually going to be working, or who are doing a job which is way below their qualification level because they've actually settled for something much less than they would have really wanted to do, or are describing themselves as self-employed because they've actually given up the idea that they will actually ever be employed by anybody else. So that reminds me of my final point, which is a name drop. When I met Nancy Pelosi in the States, and she said, well, of course, Harriet, I can't do an American accent, but, you know, politics for us is a 4-letter word, jobs. And I think that that is absolutely critical, not just people getting jobs, but the content of people's jobs and their ability to get on with it.
Thanks very much. That was a good, frank and challenging session. We're 18 minutes late. I'm sorry about that, but we go straight into the next session. One is in this room, in this hall, on the economy, and the others are all as marked on your sheet. Thanks.